What is glass made from? What is glass made from? Sand. What do we use to get to the third floor when the elevator is broken? What do we use to get to the third floor when the elevator is broken? Stairs. What is the cooking process to make cakes or bread? What is the cooking process to make cakes or bread? Baking. How many legs does a tripod have? How many legs does a tripod have? 3. What is the opposite of white? What is the opposite of white? Black. What is the opposite of maximum? What is the opposite of maximum? Minimum. What do you call the money you pay for speeding on the road? What do you call the money you pay for speeding on the road? Fine. What do eyes produce while crying? What do eyes produce while crying? Tears. What is the feeling of wanting something that someone else has? What is the feeling of wanting something that someone else has? Envy, jealousy. What does melting snow turn into? What does melting snow turn into? Water. How many days are in a leap year? How many days are in a leap year? 366. What is the most catching line of the newspaper? What is the most catching line of the newspaper? Headline. What is the collection of pictures called? What is the collection of pictures called? Album. One and half represents what percentage? One and half represents what percentage? 150%. What is the word for the place where a river starts? What is the word for the place where a river starts? Source.
How many wheels does a bicycle have? How many wheels does a bicycle have? 2. What device can be used to take photos? What device can be used to take photos? Camera. Which symbol is used to complete a sentence? Which symbol is used to complete a sentence? Full stop. In solar system, which planet can support life? In solar system, which planet can support life? Earth. What do we call people who write songs? What do we call people who write songs? Lyricist. What do you call the computer you can carry with you? What do you call the computer you can carry with you? Laptop. What is the habitat of camels? What is the habitat of camels? Desert. What is the act of students to be present at school? What is the act of students to be present at school? Attendance. The property which a new wife brings to her husband. The property which a new wife brings to her husband. Dowry. What do bees collect from flowers? What do bees collect from flowers? Honey. Pollen grains. What is the fluid that pumped from the organ related to cardiology? What is the fluid that pumped from the organ related to cardiology? Blood. What is the hardest part of your hand? What is the hardest part of your hand? Nail. What is the wet place does crocodile prefer to live in? What is the wet place does crocodile prefer to live in? Swamp. What stage is a 10-year-old child in? What stage is a 10-year-old child in? Middle childhood. In the word postgraduate, what does the post mean? In the word postgraduate, what does the post mean? After.
What is the process of teaching and learning called? What is the process of teaching and learning called? Education. What does the letter C represents for? What does the letter C represents for? Copyright. What do you call an equipment we use to look at stars? What do you call an equipment we use to look at stars? Telescope. What do you call a tank where fish or water plants are kept? What do you call a tank where fish or water plants are kept? Aquarium. What is a violent conflict between two or more countries? What is a violent conflict between two or more countries? War. What does human and animal skeleton consist of? What does human and animal skeleton consist of? Bones. What is the payment of a student's education by an organization called? What is the payment of a student's education by an organization called? Scholarship. What do you call the middle of something? What do you call the middle of something? Center. What do you call a tax on goods produced and used in a country? What do you call a tax on goods produced and used in a country? Excise tax. What type of plant is mint? What type of plant is mint? Herb. What is a piece of paper with official information written on it? What is a piece of paper with official information written on it? Document. What planet do we live in? What planet do we live in? Earth. What do we call the condition that people cannot sleep? What do we call the condition that people cannot sleep? Insomnia. What do you call the number of people living in a specific area? What do you call the number of people living in a specific area? Population. What do you call which is subject to death? What do you call which is subject to death? Mortal.
What will students receive at the end of the term? What will students receive at the end of the term? Transcript. What do you call a person who does not believe in the existence of God? What do you call a person who does not believe in the existence of God? Atheist. What do you call two children born at same time? What do you call two children born at same time? Twins. Which part of body do optometrists examine? Which part of body do optometrists examine? Eyes. What feature do pianos and computers have in common? What feature do pianos and computers have in common? Keyboard. What is the shape of an egg? What is the shape of an egg? Oval. What appliance uses electromagnetic waves to heat food in the kitchen? What appliance uses electromagnetic waves to heat food in the kitchen? Microwave. What kind of medal is awarded to the winner in a race? What kind of medal is awarded to the winner in a race? Gold. What is the ceremony called for marriage? What is the ceremony called for marriage? Wedding. Where do you pay for your purchases at a supermarket? Where do you pay for your purchases at a supermarket? Checkout. What vehicle runs on railways? What vehicle runs on railways? Train. How often is a centennial celebrated? How often is a centennial celebrated? 100 years. What is the economic sector that deals with farming? What is the economic sector that deals with farming? Agriculture. What do we call a great lover of books? What do we call a great lover of books? Bibliophile. How do we describe a person who is educated? How do we describe a person who is educated? Literate.
What fruit is used in a winery? What fruit is used in a winery? Grapes. What kind of movement of the sun can be seen during dawn? What kind of movement of the sun can be seen during dawn? Sunrise. What will you hear after a flash of lightning? What will you hear after a flash of lightning? Thunder. What is the main harmful content in a cigarette? What is the main harmful content in a cigarette? Nicotine. What organ on your face do you breathe with? What organ on your face do you breathe with? Nose. What is the thing that has iron inside and can attract iron? What is the thing that has iron inside and can attract iron? Magnet. What does a barometer measure? What does a barometer measure? Air pressure. Who sits in the cockpit of an airplane? Who sits in the cockpit of an airplane? Pilot. What would be the opposite of compulsory service? What would be the opposite of compulsory service? Voluntary service. What is the opposite of dangerous? What is the opposite of dangerous? Safe. What do we call a group of mountains such as the Himalayas? What do we call a group of mountains such as the Himalayas? Range. What do you call your nephew's dad? What do you call your nephew's dad? Brother. What do you call a flight that you buy for going and return? What do you call a flight that you buy for going and return? Round trip. What do you call a person from Netherlands? What do you call a person from Netherlands? Dutch. What part of a plant has petals? What part of a plant has petals? Flower.
What do we call a child who will soon be a teenager? What do we call a child who will soon be a teenager? Preteen, tween. Who are the drivers of the journals? Who are the drivers of the journals? Editors. In sport, what do we call the cloths that end above the knee? In sport, what do we call the cloths that end above the knee? Shorts. Which one word is used for a brother or sister? Which one word is used for a brother or sister? Sibling. What can bring astronauts to space? What can bring astronauts to space? Spacecraft. What is the line where the sky meets the land? What is the line where the sky meets the land? Skyline. What is the source of solar energy? What is the source of solar energy? Sun. What is a painting of a person's head usually called? What is a painting of a person's head usually called? Portrait. Where would you go to work out on a treadmill? Where would you go to work out on a treadmill? Gym. Which country in the world is largest in terms of area? Which country in the world is largest in terms of area? Russia. What is the smallest unit of computer memory? What is the smallest unit of computer memory? Bit. What do you call a person who works in a garage? What do you call a person who works in a garage? Mechanic. What do you call someone who cannot speak? What do you call someone who cannot speak? Dumb. What is the opposite of the word public? What is the opposite of the word public? Private. How many sides does an octagon have? How many sides does an octagon have? 8.
What financial institution do people usually go to save money? What financial institution do people usually go to save money? Bank. What shines at night in the sky and uses its own brightness? What shines at night in the sky and uses its own brightness? Star. What is the ground military force? What is the ground military force? Army. What is the nominal form of the wide? What is the nominal form of the wide? Width. What is contained in poisonous animals? What is contained in poisonous animals? Venom, poison. What do people with claustrophobia fear? What do people with claustrophobia fear? Confined space. What natural resource is used by a carpenter? What natural resource is used by a carpenter? Wood. What do you use to test the body temperature? What do you use to test the body temperature? Thermometer. What protects birds on the outside of their bodies? What protects birds on the outside of their bodies? Feather. What are the people who study history and historical evidence? What are the people who study history and historical evidence? Historian.